Jessica, could you come up here? I forgot something. But as she comes forward, what are some things that you learned about love in the last few weeks? I have a bottle of oil next to my computer. Can you get it? Okay. So what have you learned so far? What's that? It'll hold us together. Yep, that's what the song said. What else? Yep, that's a good one. It will hold us together. I'm closer to you. I'll go here, then I'll go there.
Mommies and daddies shouldn't love anybody more than God.
Mommies and daddies shouldn't love anyone more than God. God is the number one person we love.
It's the best way to approach conflict.
Best place to approach conflict. Yeah, best way. Yes. Best way to approach conflict. What else? Agape, yeah. Yeah, the Greek word for love, agape, which is the highest form of love. It's divine love. It's the love that God has for us. So this morning, I want to show you an illustration that's used by Richard Yarbrough in his commentary on 1 John. And what he's trying to do with this illustration is he is pulling out of 1 John the three major evidences that John brings up in his first letter of union with Christ. Three major evidences that you know that you are in union with Christ, or we might say fellowship with Christ. We've been speaking about one of those, which is love. But there's two others that John mentions in his letter. So the first of these is faith. And in our scripture reading this morning, all three of these are present in various places. And the scripture begins from this morning in chapter 5, verse 1 of John's first letter, page 1903 in your Pew Bible. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God. Now that verb believes is actually the verbal form of the Greek noun pistis, which is the word that is oftentimes translated faith. And this word appears regularly in 1 John, particularly in chapter 5. So the first thing is faith. Well, what is faith? What is it? Well, simply put, faith is trust. It means to trust in something. If I sit in a chair, I'm trusting that that chair will hold me. In a similar way, faith in Jesus Christ is trusting Jesus Christ. That is, trusting the things that he claimed about himself, trusting his teachings, trusting the things that he did. It's trusting Jesus Christ, who is the object of our faith. So we have faith. So we have what is faith? We have the object of our faith is Jesus Christ. And what John says here is that everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God. So our faith evidences that we have been born of God. When Nicodemus came to Jesus late at night, he was one of the high-up religious leaders, and he comes to Jesus to ask him some questions about the things that he's been doing. And Jesus says that I tell you the truth, no one can see the kingdom of God unless he has been born again. Now, every one of us in this room has had a physical birth. We've been born into this world. But what Jesus was telling Nicodemus is that not only do we need to be born into this world, but we need to have a spiritual birth as well. We need to be, as he put it, born again. And he concluded by, as he talked to Nicodemus, he said, you should not be surprised that I tell you that you must be born again. And some of the things that we do, such as baptism, confirmation, or if you grew up in a different type of denomination where they did signing affirmation of faith cards or coming up to the altar, all of those things were actually external signs that were to point to an inward reality, or an inward reality that we prayed, if you were baptized as a baby, that we prayed would happen in your life, this inward reality of being born again. So we have this thing, faith. And faith is our first part of this illustration. So we could say faith, or we could say belief. So we're going to put a big B up here for belief, and then we'll put a UN with a B and a dot for unbelief. It's the first part of our illustration. There you go, choir. First part of our illustration. And John is very concerned that we have faith. And as we go through this passage, and as we kind of go through this illustration that is illustrating all of 1 John, what John wants to tell the people that he's writing to is he wants them to be over here. He doesn't want them to be down here. He wants them to believe, to acknowledge that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. The next evidence of faith is obedience. And John says this over on. He talks about commandments. And when we're talking about love, how do we know how to love in a certain situation? How do you know what the loving thing to do in a situation is? Well, a good place to start is with God's commandments. If you want to know how to love God, start with the first 4 commandments. Have no other gods before me. Do not make for yourselves an idol. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Do not misuse the Lord your God's name. Those are pretty fundamental ways in which, by keeping those commandments, we show our love for God. If we want to know how to love God, starting with his commandments is a good place to start. If we want to know how to love other people, we could look at the latter 6 commandments. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not covet. Do not bear false testimony. Do not steal. And I think I missed one of them. But that's a good place to start, as we start with, what does God command us to do to each other? I shouldn't be stealing from someone, my employer, my neighbor, or some way I shouldn't be stealing from them. I shouldn't be coveting the things that they have. I shouldn't be murdering them. And Jesus tells us that murdering them includes speaking badly about them, or cursing them, or wanting the worst for them. A good place to start is God's commandments. So the commandments kind of teach us how to love. And if we go to verse 3 of chapter 5, John says, "This is love for God, to obey his commands, and his commands are not burdensome." And this is the interesting thing about his commands. So let's put commands here. Obedience. We'll put an O for obedience. And disobedience over here. This is where John wants us to be. He wants us to be in, well, I'm not going to do that yet. The first quadrant, we could say here. He doesn't want us to be over here. He wants us to be here. Here you go, choir. He wants, just in case you missed, this is the one, okay? This is the one he wants us to be. He doesn't want us to be over here, because we could be really obedient, but we could not believe. Or we could believe and not be obedient. He wants us here. But there's a third evidence. A third dimension is the one that we've been talking about. And this is going to make our illustration kind of wacky, so just hang in there for a little bit. He wants us to love. So if you were kind of looking at this as a cube, like it's three-dimensional, there would be 8 kind of octants in that cube. And he wants us to be there where we have love, where we have a belief, and we have obedience. Now, some people might say, well, as long as I'm a kind and nice person, I don't really have a whole lot of need for this belief or faith. I just need to be a loving, kind, nice person. But there's a problem with that. How can you know how to be a loving person unless you believe that you've been loved? Do you believe that God loved you so much that he sent his one and only Son to walk this earth for no other reason than out of love for you and to do whatever necessary to restore his relationship with you? Do you believe that he loves you? Do you believe that he loves you relentlessly, lavishly, loyally? That he'll never give up on you, and he'll keep reaching out and keep reaching out and keep reaching out and keep reaching out until you receive that love and that he knows that, so that you know that he loves you. Because if you believe that you are loved, it changes everything. How can you love another person unless you know yourself that you have been loved? If we believe that we've been loved, we know that we've been loved. And if we know that we have been loved, we're then able to love other people. In the second part of verse 1 of chapter 5, John says this: "Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God." And then he goes on to say, "And everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well." And then he says this in verse 2. "This is how we know that we love the children of God." This is how we know those have been born again of God. These are the ones who have been born of God. How do we know that we're loving them? And he says this: by loving God. Can you really say that you love people if you have indifference towards God? If God's the creator of everyone, can you really love people if you're indifferent to the creator of everybody? Or can you really say that you love God if you have indifference towards or even hatred towards the people that he's created? You can't have it. You either are loving God and loving people, or your love is in some way deficient. And this is where John wants to point us to. And I think, did you guys get the love one? So this is love. Think of it more three-dimensional. Is it confusing to see it three-dimensional? Okay, I'll try to help a little. So if we have our cube, and we have our belief line, our obedience line, then we turn this into a three-dimensional cube. It kind of looks three-dimensional. And let's see, I think I'm missing one part here. That would make it right. Well, you sort of get it. So there's actually 8 parts of this cube. And you can't see this side, so it doesn't really look like 8 completely. It looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So maybe you get it. Is it make it a little more clear? A little bit? Okay. Well, if this is the cube where love, obedience, and faith meet, this is the place where John wants the people he's writing to. And remember that John is writing to a divided, fractioned congregation. They are at odds with one another. There's a great amount of animosity. And he wants to make sure that he's holding all of these 3 together. He wants to lay hold of belief because he doesn't want them to get Jesus Christ wrong. He wants them to have a correct belief about who Jesus Christ is. But if they just had that, then they could start criticizing everyone who doesn't have that, and they can start hating them, and that would just make the problem worse. So he also wants to tell them to be obedient. But he knows that obedience can be very cold and calculating, so he also wants them to know that one of the supreme things we're supposed to do is always have an attitude of love. So he's putting all these things together, and he goes, that's the cube that I want you in, this little front one over here. So, because that's where he wants them to be. Faith is, in a sense, the essential entryway into love. Faith is the essential entryway into love. If we don't have faith, we can't truly love the way that God designed us to love. And if you look at the last two verses of the passage we're looking at this morning, it's this. Verse 4 and 5. For everyone born of God overcomes the world. And for those of you who've been tracking in the series, you know that the world is not the physical world but it's the ways of the world, the darkened ways of the world. In John's letter, he describes some of them as the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of humanity. And he says that all of these things are under the control of the evil one. It's the darkness of the world, and that darkness always wants to pull us to it. It's almost like a gravity. It always wants to pull us into that darkness so that we slip into those ways of hatred, those ways of disobedience, and those ways of unbelief. So that's the world. But John says, for everyone born of God overcomes the world. And he says this is the victory. What is the victory? This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. How are you to overcome all the animosity around you? How are you to overcome when the darkness is constantly pulling you into it? And John says that the answer is our faith. It's our faith that we have been loved, that we've been called to love, that we're commanded to love, and that we can meet all of that animosity with love. And our faith then enables us to overcome all that darkness. If you remember from several sermons ago, you will remember the story of Fred the frog and the lily pads. And Fred the frog was in this enchanted pond, and he had to figure out which lily pad he wanted to live on. And if he jumped on one lily pad, it was all dark and dreary, and hatred had filled his heart. But then he jumped on another lily pad, and it was life, and it was bright, and it was joy. What John is saying is that this is the lily pad I want you to put your feet on. I want you to put your feet on the lily pad where belief, love, and obedience intersect, where all those things are present. Because all those other things might look pretty good, but they're deficient, and in all of them there's vestiges of darkness that remain in those things. I want you to have fellowship with God. I want you to have joy. I want you to know all the joy that God has designed this world to be for you and for all of creation. This is the lily pad I want you to set your feet upon. This is the place that I want you to dwell. So that's our illustration. However, we've been talking about love for quite some time, and I want to give you an opportunity to respond. From time to time, we have to reaffirm the faith that we believe. That's one of the things that we do. Oftentimes as Presbyterians, we might do a baptismal renewal, which we're going to do today. But instead, I'm going to invite you to remember your baptism in a different way by reaffirming your faith. During the song of response, I'm going to be up here, I'll have some oil, and if you want to be anointed with that oil as a sign that you want to reaffirm your belief that Jesus really has loved you this much and you want to love everybody in this world the way that he has loved you, just come forward and I'll anoint you with oil. And it will be a sign that you want to receive this love. Now, I understand as Presbyterians, this could be a little bit uncomfortable. We don't usually do things like this, at least nowadays. There was a time when we did, but we don't anymore. Don't let this be uncomfortable. If you want to reaffirm your belief that Jesus really is the Christ who came to save us from the darkness of the world, if you want to reaffirm your desire to keep his commands, which are his code of love, if you want to reaffirm your desire to share his love in this world, come forward. There's nothing magical or scary about it. It's just a time for you to publicly say, I want to reaffirm this in my life. So if you're sitting on the end of the pew, make sure that if someone's in the middle of the pew can get out if they would like to do this. And hey, it's up to you. Nobody's pushing you. But from time to time, we have to reaffirm that we really do want to live in